Hey Ellis, Tommy here. Thanks for your work in week 8. And I think that you may have hoped to join a Zoom session. I'm realizing at 3 o'clock on Friday, not realizing that it was an in-person discussion. So sorry if that's what happened. And you mentioned you were looking forward to talking about some issues that were confusing to you in the Zoom discussion. So I hope we're going to find some way to follow up. But at the very least, I thought I'd send you this video reply and speak to the questions that you raise, especially in Forum 1. But before I do, let me just say I think you have really hit the nail on the head here in Forum 2 with how you have sort of expressed the rhetorical force of Paul's claims about salvation, namely that the audience, including us, are in no place to boast, but instead are in a place of witness to the gratuitous or gracious way that God saves us, the way that God does it as a gift, inspiring a belief in the heart and drawing forth a confession on the lips that Jesus is Lord, as opposed to conceiving of those things, belief and confession, as like conditions that we have to meet in some kind of contract with God for our salvation. That's often how this passage is understood, but I think you have demonstrated just with these few words you've written that doesn't fit the force of Paul's argument in Romans 9 to 11, or really anything else that he's taught about salvation earlier in Romans. So well done on that front. We can keep talking about it. But this is maybe why you find the end of this argument in chapter 11 confusing. And of course, we're going to be talking about this here in week 9. So I hope we can get some kind of live time together. But as Paul comes to the end, where he is telling the audience that these relatives of his that are acting as enemies of them are not, in fact, uh, cast off or finally rejected, but in this kind of temporary hardening by God, are still embraced by God's election. And that is because, as he says in this key passage that you understandably find confusing, that they may be enemies because of you, according to the gospel, but according to election, they are uh, beloved because of the ancestors. So they're held together in this family, I hear Paul to be saying there, by God's election, by a promise that God made to their ancestors, and God simply will not let them go. No matter how hard you might say they push against this movement of God. Um, so your question, I think, is about, whether or not this undermines Paul's argument for the way that God works by claiming here quite clearly that it is through ancestry. So that's what I want to try to speak to. I think that we often imagine that uh, ancestry is like this thing that happens through blood relationships over generations. And the gospel or God's revelation is somehow about how this does not finally matter because there's another way that God forms the family. And as common as that is, I think that framework does not work because throughout the Bible, and this includes all of Paul's letters, including Romans, there is no sense that ancestry by blood is a thing at all. So it's not that Paul has to argue against that or that God's revelation works against that, because nobody thinks that that's actually what holds a family together across generations. All of the sort of memory of the Bible, of the history of Israel, is full of foreign peoples being adopted into the people of God. Abraham himself is pictured as a wandering Aramean. Um, you might remember Jesus's genealogy in Matthew that includes Gentile mothers. This genealogy itself is based on First Chronicles, which records those Gentile mothers of King David. So no one actually thinks that going far, far back, that you could ever retrace the sort of family exclusively in terms of blood or genes or something like that. Instead, everybody understands that while the family is sustained partly by parents having children who grow up to get married and have children, et cetera, that what sustains that life of parents raising their children so that they don't forget who they are, and those children themselves having children that they raise and don't forget who they are, and all along the way, their ability to adopt people into that family who are incorporated into it and then know that family's history as their own and themselves produce descendants in that family. All of that intergenerational life that produces a name and a memory, a social reality on the earth, that happens by powers that are difficult to trace. And Paul's claim is that that happens by faith, that it is God's faith or faithfulness that sustains this family over generations. And what sort of corresponds to that faith of God is the trust or faith of the human that sort of God inspires and that maintains the memory of the people over generations so that they don't assimilate to other peoples to the point that they become extinct, but instead retain their memory and their hope and their future on the earth. That's what I think Paul understands to sort of make tick the family of Israel from Abraham to the present, including you and me. So that means that ancestry and faith are not competitive. Faith is actually what constitutes ancestry, as Paul understands it. And this means then that we can't sort of reduce this picture of the family to what happens in every single individual case, right? As if, every Israelite person that's ever lived and been part of the family has themselves been faithful, because clear that that's not the case. And this is also true of Paul's relatives that are in view. They're enemies of the audience. They're being unfaithful. But the unfaithfulness of particular members of the family doesn't cancel or undermine the faith of God, which is expressed as God's election of this family that holds them together so that even when particular members of the family are disobedient or unfaithful, God does not give up on them, but continues to pursue them until they are finally redeemed. And Paul understands this to culminate in, as you've said, the mercy of God upon all. So, don't know if that helps as an explanation of how what Paul says in 11, 28, and 29 can make sense with what he's been arguing throughout the letter, what he says in chapter 10 about salvation that is borne witness by this confession of Jesus as Lord and conviction of the resurrection of him from the dead in the heart. But that, I think, is what he's saying. One last thing, I just realized I didn't say anything about it. The Agamben thing, super hard article. So thanks for trying to wade through it. And I think you actually hit on something that is really at the heart of it and what I really wanted to highlight about it. And that is that for Agamben, the word of faith, this word that sort of kind of emerges from people that Jesus is Lord, is not something that sort of corresponds to certain state of affairs in the world that would be measurable. That's why it actually corresponds to you might say, invisible conviction in the heart that God raised Jesus from the dead. It doesn't prescribe certain conditions that have to be met in order for the contract to hold true. Instead, it has a kind of weakness to it, meaning that it doesn't sort of produce some fortress of itself in the world to defend itself. It's just this word that keeps coming and doesn't stop. And for Agamben, that is actually its power. It's powerful in and through its weakness by not producing a fortress of itself that could be destroyed, but instead continuing to, you might say, impress itself upon the world as meaningful, as hopeful, as true, as real, no matter what systems human beings put in place, however they might distort it with contracts or governments or systems. Those will break down over time, and the word itself will continue to speak Jesus is Lord. And that's how it's powerful in its weakness. That's how it can render inoperative certain laws, even laws attributed to God, that are attached to it, but don't finally express it adequately. So that's kind of what I think he's trying to say. And of course, this is the way that faith, according to Agamben and his reading of Paul, has operated throughout the history of the people of God. Whatever destruction they have undergone, the word of faith, the memory of who they are, the hope of the Messiah, finally the Messiah himself as the embodiment of that word, Jesus the Lord, has remained and remained powerful and guiding the future of the people to embrace even us. Okay, long reply. Hope this was helpful to you. Thanks again for your responses in week 8.